Well, thank you, Charlotte. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to thank the European Climate Foundation for inviting me today to do what I hope is an interesting presentation on global risk from an economic perspective, looking at Arctic change. I'd also like to say it's my first trip to Reykjavik, and I think I've fallen in love with the city. It's a beautiful place, and I think we're very lucky to be in such a gorgeous, gorgeous conference center. Now, the title of my talk is The Arctic as a Barometer of Global Risk. And I'm a social scientist, and I work a lot with natural scientists through the ICEARC program, British Antarctic Survey, who is the coordinator of that transdisciplinary research grant funded by the European Commission. But I also work a lot with economists, and the reason why I combine these things is that one of my roles at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is to advise on cutting-edge science that is relevant to business and sustainability, and also to identify emerging business risks. As a Canadian, the Great White North is an important part of my cultural identity, and I spent 2 years in the subarctic doing my PhD. But I also think that actually for business, aside from shipping or extractive industries, the Arctic is really an absolutely key emerging business opportunity, but also business risk. Now, when we talk about risk, I think, you know, from the groups that I talk to, and World Business Council is a collection of 200 multinational companies representing annual sales of $10 trillion each year. So it's significant a part of our global economy. When we talk about global risk, we often look at graphs like this. When we see a graph like this, if this is the FTSE, if this is the pound sterling as of a Friday morning, we have some concern. This is going in the wrong direction. If this is cost of goods sold, actually, that's a good thing. We can make more profit. So we tend to take a look at barometers of risk, and we look at them in this sort of way. Now, we know that the FTSE, for example, is a key indicator in the economic system where we try to see what is the resilience and what is the strength or the vulnerability of the global economy. And certainly living in the UK now at Lancaster University, post-Brexit, there was a lot of play in terms of where did the FTSE go? Has it rebounded? Where are we doing? So the issue of things like the FTSE, which the FTSE 100 is today up, the Dow Jones is today down, is an important measure that the audiences of big business look at, so the audiences that I deal with. Now, when we look at global risk, it's not only about, of course, a diagram and a slope. The World Economic Forum, who I also do work with, publishes a very influential global risk report every year. And I'm very pleased to say that it's 700 experts that it interviews every year to develop this report. In 2006, for the first time, listed climate change as the key risk for business, for industry, and for society around the world. So it's not just what the FTSE is doing, it is also this issue of climate change. But what I suggest, and if we could put the video on now, please, as a background, is that the hidden risk for these groups is really the Arctic. Now, we know that less than 50 years ago, the Arctic was largely a frozen ice cap with marginal melt around the edges. We've got extremely good data in terms of natural science, in terms of measuring this. This is, for example, a passive microwave satellite image of an annual cycle from around 2000 of how the Arctic ebbs and flows. It's dynamic, it always has been. It grows, the sea ice grows in the winter, in the summer it comes back. But nevertheless, we have 40 years of data showing that really the Arctic is ground zero for climate change. And we can see that the intense Arctic amplification of global warming is resulting in melting glaciers, melting sea ice, thawing permafrost on land, potentially subsea, as well as ocean acidification. And of course, there's just these massive changes happening both on marine and on land. So while the Arctic is something that has always had flux and change, it is at a point from a natural science perspective that is serious, and we have to look at that as a global risk. Now, let's take a look at summer sea ice. Now, summer sea ice in the audiences I deal with, CEOs, I was with a collection of about 60 CEOs in India last week, and probably none of them were paying attention to the summer sea ice melt every mid-September, which we know happens. If we can go to the next slide, please. This one. And yet, to be honest, I think this is a big wake-up call. 2016 is the second lowest summer sea ice extent, and we know that 2012 was also an incredibly bad year. And it's not a year-on-year variation, it's the onward, downward trend. So what we're seeing in summer sea ice is incredibly problematic. In addition, though, I think what we're seeing in winter sea ice is also a problem. Now, this is a decadal chart showing the changes every March, and we can see that, again, we are going down about 2.7% per decade in winter ice. And in winter, obviously, things are pretty cold, and why, in fact, is that happening? And I think that's the way science can help inform business risk. Now, I don't know how many of you remember what you were doing on New Year's Eve in 2015, and some of you may indeed have been in Times Square. I've been in Times Square before, certainly not this last year, but I think it's a way we celebrate the end of one year and the beginning of another. But if we take a look at what was happening in the Arctic on New Year's Eve, the sensors that we have from the IceArc program were showing an incredible, unprecedented, above normal warming. So it was an intense heat in a polar night. It should be very cold, and indeed it was not. This kind of variability was incredibly surprising. And if we go to Svalbard, which is the most northern inhabited island, we can see that instead of being probably well into the -20s, we were in fact 6.4 degrees Celsius during the day, which went up to 8 degrees Celsius. So while most of us were getting in our party dresses or getting our champagne out, the Arctic was sending us a huge warning cry that largely, with the audiences in terms of big business, went unnoticed. And I think that's what we really need to take a look at in terms of emerging business risk. Now, also taking a look at Greenland. Now, I know that Connie Steffen did a great presentation with the Swiss group yesterday, and I think it's important to realize the very long engagement that Swiss science, along with US science and many other regions around the world, have had in terms of really looking at what's going on with Greenland. Now, we are losing about 350 gigatons every year. Now, that sounds like a huge number, and it is a huge number, except Greenland's got a lot, so it's certainly not going anytime soon. But to put that number in perspective, that's about 6 times the size of the glaciers in the Alps in Europe. We're losing that every year. Now, we know it's been melting since about 2000 because there's been measures in terms of automatic weather stations in Greenland. We also saw in April of this year the first time unprecedented melt on the western coast at about 2,000 elevation. So again, when it should be very cold, we saw that it was unseasonably warm. And I think the picture on your left, or is it your right, my left, is a Swiss camp, and I know that Connie showed this picture, or a similar one, yesterday. Now, this was set up in 1990. It was a visionary moment, I think, in Arctic science, where indeed what we saw Connie and his team do was to put in a place of a camp where they could measure where they were every year. And this was specifically put at the line of equilibrium, where Greenland grew and melted. So this was exactly where, if Greenland stayed in balance, it should be maintained. Now, I think it's pretty clear from this picture that that has changed significantly. The equivalent line has moved 50 kilometers inland since 1990, when this was first put up, and has actually melted 12 meters. And when you see that, those of you that have not gone there yourself, it's a massive indication that Greenland itself, although a massively large piece of the ecosystem, is also undergoing massive change. Now, what does this have to do about global risk, and especially global economic risk, which is my expertise in the team that they work with? Now, basically, the idea here is that there's opportunities economically, of course, in the Arctic, and many speakers will have talked about that today and earlier. But what my group is looking at is what are the teleconnections, and how does the things that happen in the Arctic affect the global economy? And we know that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay. And this is part of a European Commission-funded IceArc program, so we're very thankful to them. Now, usually when I talk to the World Economic Forum type of folks, When I talk about economic issues in the Arctic, the first thing that pops up is shipping. Indeed, that should be a tremendous economic opportunity for Arctic countries and as well as for other countries that are using other routes to ship their goods and services. And you know, there's no question that is the case. If we look at the Northern Sea route, we can see a 40% in savings, which in terms of distance and likely cost is pretty significant if you're a business actor. However, the team, and I'm very happy that Dr. Dmitry Yumashev is on the panel today, his results look at that when you have increased shipping, and he will go through the details of how we came up with that, you also have things, given the current types of fuel that we use, a lot of short-lived pollutants, which indeed carry climate costs. So when we actually take a look at that although there are certainly economic benefits of Arctic shipping, we can see that as Arctic shipping increases over time, our estimates are that there's probably a USD 10 trillion net present value in climate costs associated with that. Perhaps even more importantly for those countries outside the Arctic is that the gains and losses of this are not evenly spread around the world. We can see that the EU will win from that. We can see certainly that China will win. OECD countries, including Japan and Korea, will also have significant economic benefits from that, and that are not really offset by the impacts of the short-lived pollutants in terms of increased climate costs and impacts. What we do see is that there's definitely going to be some losers. India, Africa, and as well as parts of Latin America will gain very little from Arctic shipping, but probably will experience a lot of the costs from short-lived climate amplification from the pollutants. So indeed, I guess the premise that we have is that Arctic change accelerates climate change costs globally. So if we see that there's 10 trillion USD coming from potential increases in Arctic shipping, what else can we see? There was a paper published last year in Nature Climate Change by Kevin Schaefer and Chris Hope at Cambridge, which looked at what are the impacts of land permafrost thaw. Net present value of that was somewhere around estimates of 40 trillion US dollars, again spread disproportionately around the world. The science on land permafrost thaw is fairly solid. There's also been some preliminary work looking at subsea methane release, particularly in the Russian areas. And the cost of that in the worst case scenario could be up to 60 trillion US dollars over time. So what we see is that Arctic change accelerates climate costs from the loss of Arctic albedo, and indeed can increase the point at which we get to a 2-degree warmer world. In addition, though, we know that Arctic as a system affects lots of things around the world. The science is emerging on this, but certainly the work that Jennifer Francis has been doing, looking at the Arctic change and impacts on the jet stream, suggests that there may be links with extreme weather events around the world. And if I talk to the insurance industries, they're interested in charts like this, because the top 5 largest natural catastrophes last year by insured losses are all extreme weather events. US, Canada, US, Europe, and USA. Now, it's hard to put a finger and say this is directly related to the Arctic. We need a lot more science to be able to do that, but what we can see is that indeed that is a problem. In addition, sea level risk is also there. We know certainly as Arctic change happens, we have impact on sea level rise, but of course the big elephant in the room would be how much of Greenland will go and how quickly. That will take thousands of years, but nevertheless, the millimeter by millimeter shift that we have now makes a difference to both people around the world and the insured capital, which are the groups that I'm talking to. Now, global agricultural risk is also something that our team is looking at. These are the 4 most important crops around the world: maize, rice, wheat, and potatoes. And you can see they've steadily been going up. That's a great chart that business likes to see. However, given that the Arctic affects the precipitation cycles around the world, we're trying to figure out what's the impact of risk for the global agricultural sector. As the Arctic is amplified in terms of its change, what are the risks for global agriculture? And we're currently working on that. So as I move into the conclusion that if we look at the top business risks in 2016, we can see that climate change does appear on there, but perhaps not as high as it should. And indeed, when we come back to charts like this, the FTSE is important, but this is not actually the FTSE. This is the Arctic summer sea ice extent. And from that perspective, I think that we can see that the Arctic is the real barometer of global risk. Now, if it's a risk, what needs to be done? The audiences in business that I talk to don't like to hear risks are coming down the pipeline and there's nothing that can be done. I think there's 4 things we could do. First of all, we need more transdisciplinary science to consider how best to address these global risks. How do we bring natural science, perhaps citizen science, together with economic modeling? It's not really very easily understood, and it's something that we are starting with, but we need a lot more work to be done. Secondly, we have to communicate Arctic science to global leaders. And I think organizations like the Arctic Circle in this kind of event is excellent. Certainly there was a lot of play on the Arctic at COP21. His Excellency Ban Ki-moon was at a wonderful session hosted by the Norwegian government. We also can see that the US Arctic Science Ministerial is increasing the global attention to Arctic issues. But in addition, I really think that we need to be at places like Davos. The World Economic Forum's annual meeting is really where global risk is discussed. Of course they will talk about migration. Of course they will talk about Brexit this year. But we know that the WEF constituency realizes that climate change is an issue, and the Arctic needs to be there as well. Third, though, I think we need to take a look at some kind of transnational superfund for global risk analysis related to Arctic change. Arctic scientists work across nationalities, across borders. However, most of the funding for Arctic science is nation controlled, and there's very little super funds that actually can push this agenda forward in the way that it needs to be. And maybe Superfund is really talking to my groups. Maybe what we're really looking here is some sort of global risk analysis institute on Arctic change. I'm ambivalent. Either way, I think we need resources, but what we need is some organization to really push this issue of global risk forward. And the final point is I think we need breakthrough funding. I think it's time that we can see that and say thank you to all of the national countries, of which there's 40 that support national science in the Arctic. But I think we need to also look at the high-tech philanthropists and get them out of their suits and into parkas. Thank you.